If you are new to photography and are battling to understand the mechanics or how the system works, or you're confused by the terminology, you are in the right place. In just 13 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how photography works. And it's not that difficult at all. Remember that photography has been passed down to us through mathematicians, scientists, and chemists. And although the system is brilliant, the terminology sometimes can be quite baffling. Now, for this video to have any value to you, you need to be working on a digital single lens reflex camera or a mirrorless camera. And the great thing is, what I'm going to be showing you today, you can apply to any camera. So regardless of whether you're shooting on a Nikon, a Canon, a Fuji, a Sony, a Pentax, or whatever, you'll be able to take what you're about to learn and apply it to your own camera. So let me show you exactly how photography works. Now, for this instruction, I'm going to show you in manual mode because it's important that you learn to control the system yourself. So we're not going to be using any automatic or program mode whatsoever. I also suggest that you don't have your camera open in front of you, and I also suggest that you keep your instruction booklet closed. You can consult the booklet later and see how everything works on your camera. First, understand the system itself. Now, there are three main exposure controls in photography. They are your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter. There's another control known as the light meter, and we're going to talk about exposure value shortly. But first, understand that the entire photography system is governed by a stop. It's the unit of measurement in photography. It's logarithmic, and it works on a doubling and halving basis. Imagine you were in a dark room with one candle burning, and I asked you to increase the light by a stop. You need to light 2 candles in order to do so. And then when you have 2 candles burning and I ask you to increase the light further by a stop, you'd have to light 4 candles, then 8 candles, 16 candles, 32 candles, and so on, each time increasing the light by a stop. A stop, in essence, indicates a change. Something has happened, and it governs everything in photography. It is our unit of measurement, and it's basically the lingo that we use. So let us start off with ISO. ISO essentially is the measurement of the sensitivity of the digital chip to light. Look, the word photography in essence means drawing with light or painting with light. So when we're talking about ISO, we're talking about the sensitivity of what we are drawing or painting onto. In this case, it is a digital chip. Now, ISO is measured in numerical numbers, starting from usually around 100 and working up from that. So you will see an ISO of 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, and so on. ISO itself is also measured in stops, as we've already discussed. So the difference between 100 ISO and 200 ISO is 1 stop. The difference between 100 ISO and 400 ISO is 2 stops, and so on. Now, when you do consult your instruction booklet or you do work with your camera, you're going to see that there's numbers in between it. So in between 100 to 200, for example, you're more than likely going to have a 125 and a 160. Don't worry about this. This is just third stops, and it just offers more control in your photography. Now, ISO is a very, very important setting. In fact, it is foundational, and it should be the first setting you consider in most cases. You're going to choose ISO for many reasons, but the 2 main ones are the intensity of the light that you're working in and the quality that you're wanting to capture. 100 ISO is less sensitive to light, and it's going to offer you the best quality. Something like a 6400 ISO is much more sensitive to light, but it's going to record with quite a lot of noise. Now remember, for every camera model and for every type of sensor that you may be working on, the ISO characteristic around how much noise it records is going to be different. Now let's have a look at AV, which stands for aperture value. As the light comes in through the lens of the camera, it's going to pass through a mechanism known as an aperture. The aperture is very similar to the design of the pupil of the human eye. And your aperture is really small, it's going to let through less light. And as the aperture increases in size, so it's going to let through more and more light. Now, the aperture numbers do look a little bit different. You'll see that there's numbers like 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, and 22, just to name a few. And what you will also realize as you start getting into photography, that these numbers are not just unusual, but they also seem to be backwards. For example, 2.8, although it's a low numerical number, lets in a lot more light than what you would get through an aperture of 22, which is a high numerical value. But this number is merely the result of a calculation that works out the size of the opening proportionate to the size of the lens you're using. And the other strange thing about aperture is that it's not just known as a stop, but rather as an f-stop. And the f merely refers back to the focal length of the lens where the calculation has been made. So for everything else in photography, we talk about a stop. With aperture, we're talking about an f-stop. So aperture regulates the amount of light coming in through your lens. But when choosing an aperture, you may very well choose an aperture based on the amount of light that you're photographing in. But then you must also keep in mind that besides this, aperture also affects depth and image resolution or quality in photography. So on the one side of the camera, you've got the light coming in through the lens regulated by an aperture. On the other side of the camera, you've got the light-sensitive medium or digital chip waiting to be exposed. So there needs to be something in between these two to get them to work together. And indeed there is. Right in front of your digital chip, there is a door. And this door is known as a shutter. And a shutter merely facilitates exposure. It's called TV, which stands for time value. So here you're ready to go. Your ISO is set. You press the button of the camera. The aperture engages to the size you have chosen, and only then this door opens and allows light to pass through it. It's not just any door, it's almost like a sliding door. So it slides open, allows the light to pass, and then it slides closed after that. The shutter is governed by time, and it works in fractions of seconds, and even minutes. And the longer the shutter stays open, the more light the digital chip is going to receive. These shutter speeds are really quick today. I mean, in a lot of the cameras, it's not unusual to get a shutter speed of 1/8,000th of a second. Now, that is really quick. I mean, if we take 1 second and we divide it into 8,000 equal parts, we're talking about a really fast shutter speed. And shutter speeds are measured, as I've said before, in stops. So if you take 1/8,000th of a second and you halve that, we've got 1/4,000th of a second. So the difference between those two is one stop. That's exactly the same difference between 100 to 200 ISO, for example, or the same difference between, let's say, an aperture of f8 and f11. Now, although you can choose a shutter speed on the amount of light you're working in, what you must realize is that shutter controls or influences movement in photography. These three, ISO, aperture, and shutter, are equally important. You cannot choose one without considering the other. So you'll soon see that photography is all about choices. Firstly, it's about the choice of light that you're working in, and then it's about your exposure combinations. And these combinations, each one of them is going to deliver a different result. So as I've said, we normally choose two controls within the exposure triangle, and then we set the other. So let's say we've set the ISO and the aperture. Now we need to find out which shutter speed we should be using to gain a correct exposure. Or let's say we've set the ISO and the shutter. We need to find out which aperture we should be using. Now, how do we do this? Well, here we need what is known as a light meter. A light meter is situated inside the camera, and it is an indicator. It does nothing more than tell us which shutter speed, aperture, and ISO combination will deliver correct exposure. It looks something like this, and it usually has 2 to 3 stops either side of 0, and it's indicating over and under exposure. And the 0 is indicating what is supposedly correct exposure, but you're soon going to see that this is not always the case. In order to activate the light meter on a mirrorless or DSLR camera, you need to lightly press down on the exposure button. And you'll also find out that your camera more than likely has more than one light meter reading mode. So this is where it actually takes the light meter reading off your subject. And you will be able to work through these different modes and see which one works best in different situations. So as a summary, within the photographic system, any given brightness of light that we find ourselves photographing in, where we've set a specific ISO setting, there will be a whole lot of shutter speeds and aperture combinations that we'll be able to work with. We'll be able to use these combinations based on the information that the light meter is giving us. And to get the best results, you need to be in manual mode. So have you ever wondered what are these other settings that are right next to the manual mode on the camera? It's usually on one of the top dials of the camera, and you will see there's a TV mode, a S mode, a AV mode, a mode, and all of these. What are these? Well, they are automated choices. So here you could set 2 of them and the camera will set the other automatically, or in a program mode, it will set everything for you. As I've said to you, it's best that you take control of your photography yourself. And you will soon see that once you've learned to work in manual mode, there's going to be very little reason for you to go back to any of these automated modes. So here we've spoken about exposure, but we haven't spoken about focus. You're going to notice that on the top of your lens or on the camera body, you will have an AF/MF option where you can set the camera from manual focus to autofocus. So you can decide whether you want the autofocus of the camera to do the job for you or whether you want to focus manually yourself. But remember that focus is not a necessity in photography. So you can choose whether you want your picture in focus or in fact even out of focus. And you can choose what areas of the picture you want to focus on. What we've just discussed up to this point is most certainly a necessity. As you can appreciate, there's still so much more to learn. I mean, we haven't even discussed the file formats we should be shooting on, depth of field, color of light, composition for that matter, visual communications, and developing and editing of pictures. If you have found what we've discussed today of value and you want to know more, then consider looking at my Essentials and Advanced Photography class that I teach on the Art Photography Academy. In the Essentials Photography class, I take what we've just done today, but then discuss it in a lot more detail. And as we speak, I believe that the course is still on promotion where you can pay whatever you can afford, starting as low as $1. So there is no excuse why you cannot go further in your basic understanding of photography. Remember, what we have discussed today is the basic photographic system itself. It is the foundation that you can build off. You need to take this information and then apply it to your photography in order to become a better photographer. So until next time, cheers for now.